The chandelier's crystals glittered like diamonds, casting a warm glow across the opulent dining room. Emily Weston's heels clicked softly against the marble floor as she carried a tray of freshly poured drinks to the table. Everything had to be perfect tonight. Andrew, her husband, had invited a group of influential business partners over for dinner, and as always, Emily had spared no effort to create an evening worthy of their status. The room buzzed with polite laughter and clinking glasses. Andrew, ever the charming host, held court at the head of the table, his dark suit impeccably tailored, his smile exuding confidence. Emily, a graceful woman with dark, wavy hair and a presence that commanded quiet admiration, floated between the guests, ensuring every detail met their satisfaction. To the outside world, their life was a picture of elegance and success. But beneath the surface, Emily felt a gnawing emptiness she couldn't quite articulate. The evenings that used to fill her with pride now felt more like performances, Andrew the star and she the stagehand. Still, she played her role, setting down a glass in front of a guest and offering a warm, practiced smile. "Emily, darling, you've outdone yourself again," Andrew said, raising his glass in a toast. The room erupted in polite applause, and Emily smiled demurely, accepting the praise as she always did. As the dinner wound down and the guests began to filter out, Emily found herself alone in the kitchen, tidying up. She glanced at her phone and saw a text message notification from an unknown number. Curiosity piqued, she opened it. "Can't wait to see you again. Last night was unforgettable." Her stomach dropped. The message wasn't meant for her. Heart pounding, she stared at the screen, rereading the words until their meaning became undeniable. A mix of shock, anger, and disbelief coursed through her. She quickly locked the phone and tucked it back into her pocket before Andrew walked in. "Great night, wasn't it?" he said, leaning casually against the counter, his tie loosened. Emily forced a smile, her mind racing. "Yes, everything went perfectly," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Over the next few days, Emily's mind kept returning to that message. She began to notice subtle changes in Andrew's behavior, the late-night phone calls, the sudden need for meetings that left her alone in their sprawling mansion. The cracks in their perfect world were widening, and Emily's unease grew. Then, at a charity gala that Andrew insisted they attend together, Emily's suspicions crystallized. As they mingled with the crowd, she noticed a striking blonde woman across the room. Chelsea. She was young, radiant, and undeniably alluring. Emily had seen her before, introduced by Andrew as a business associate, but now the lingering glances and subtle smiles between them painted a different picture. Later that evening, back at home, Emily waited until Andrew was asleep. She retrieved his phone and carefully scrolled through the messages. Her hands trembled as she found undeniable proof of his affair with Chelsea, photos, texts, even plans for a private weekend getaway. Emily's world shattered in that moment. The husband she had supported, the life they had built together, all of it felt like a cruel illusion. But instead of confronting him outright, she resolved to observe, to understand the depth of his betrayal before deciding her next move. Her dark eyes reflected determination as she stared at herself in the mirror. If Andrew thought he could play her for a fool, he was sorely mistaken. This was far from over. The days following Emily's discovery were filled with a suffocating silence. She moved through the house like a shadow, her presence unnoticed as Andrew continued his routine. Despite the turmoil inside her, she refused to let him see even a glimmer of doubt in her demeanor. Each meal she prepared, each polite conversation she endured, was a test of her composure. Andrew's behavior, however, began to shift. He seemed more careful, more distant. His phone, once left carelessly on counters and coffee tables, was now constantly in his pocket. His late-night meetings became more frequent, and Emily's suspicions deepened with every excuse he offered. One evening, as Andrew prepared to leave for another business dinner, Emily decided to follow him. She slipped into her car moments after he pulled out of the driveway, keeping a safe distance as he navigated the city streets. Her heart pounded as she tailed him to a quiet, upscale restaurant on the outskirts of town. Through the restaurant's glass windows, Emily saw him seated at a dimly lit table opposite Chelsea. The sight of them laughing, their heads leaning close together, sent a fresh wave of anger and heartbreak crashing over her. She fought the urge to storm inside, instead retreating to her car to collect her thoughts. "You'll get what's coming to you," she whispered to herself, gripping the steering wheel. The image of Chelsea's blonde hair shimmering under the restaurant lights burned into her memory. Emily knew she needed a plan, but her thoughts were scattered, her emotions too raw. When Andrew returned home that night, Emily was already in bed, feigning sleep. She heard him undress and slip under the covers, his breathing even and untroubled. It was as if his betrayal weighed nothing on his conscience. Emily's hands clenched into fists beneath the sheets. If Andrew had no remorse, then she would have to be the one to teach him the consequences of his actions. The next morning, Andrew announced he was hosting a small gathering at their mansion to celebrate the closing of a major business deal. Emily, ever the dutiful wife, agreed to handle the arrangements. But this time, she wasn't just planning a party, she was laying the groundwork for something much bigger. As the day of the event approached, Emily's demeanor remained calm, her movements deliberate. She watched Andrew and Chelsea closely, noting every glance, every shared laugh. Her mind worked tirelessly, piecing together the puzzle of their deceit while preparing for the moment she would take control of the narrative. The evening of the party arrived, and the mansion was once again filled with the hum of polite conversation and clinking glasses. Emily moved gracefully among the guests, her dark eyes scanning the room for any sign of Chelsea. When the blonde finally appeared, her entrance was as dramatic as Emily had expected, drawing Andrew's attention like a magnet. Emily's jaw tightened, but she maintained her composure. Tonight was not the night for confrontation, but it was a step closer to uncovering the truth. As the guests toasted Andrew's success, Emily raised her glass with a smile, her mind already plotting her next move. The mansion glittered under the soft glow of the moon, its grand windows illuminated with the golden light of the party. Guests mingled in the spacious living room, their laughter and conversations weaving a tapestry of celebration. Emily drifted through the crowd, her polished demeanor betraying none of the turmoil that simmered beneath her calm exterior. Andrew stood near the grand piano, holding court with a group of business associates, his deep laughter cutting through the room. Emily watched from a distance, her dark eyes scanning every interaction, every subtle movement. She had ensured every detail of the evening was flawless, knowing that tonight could very well mark a turning point in her life. As the evening progressed, Chelsea's presence became impossible to ignore. Draped in a sleek, golden gown that hugged her figure, she moved through the room with an air of confidence that made Emily's stomach churn. She saw the way Andrew's eyes followed Chelsea, his expression softening whenever their gazes met. To the guests, it might have seemed like a harmless exchange, but to Emily, it was another dagger to the heart. Emily's plan was simple but calculated. She ensured that the wine Andrew preferred was prominently displayed, knowing it would draw his attention. As she mingled with the guests, she subtly observed him pour a glass from the bottle, raising it in a toast with his friends. Her heart raced, but she maintained her composure, knowing that the night was far from over. The first sign of trouble came when Andrew staggered slightly, his hand gripping the edge of the table for support. The room fell silent as he tried to steady himself, his face pale and beads of sweat forming on his forehead. "I'm fine," he muttered, waving off concerned guests, but his words were slurred, and his body betrayed him as he collapsed to the floor. Panic erupted. Guests rushed to his side, someone shouting to call an ambulance. Emily knelt beside him, her hand resting on his arm as she feigned shock and concern. Her mind raced as she assessed the situation, the weight of her actions settling heavily on her chest. She hadn't expected the reaction to be so immediate, nor had she anticipated the chaos that would ensue. The ambulance arrived within minutes, the paramedics swiftly attending to Andrew as he slipped into unconsciousness. Emily stood to the side, her hands clasped tightly together, her expression carefully neutral. She felt Chelsea's eyes on her, the blonde's face pale with fear and suspicion. For a brief moment, their gazes met, and Emily saw something she hadn't expected: doubt. As the ambulance pulled away, taking Andrew to the hospital, the guests began to disperse, their whispers filling the air with speculation. Emily remained behind, her mind racing with questions and fears. Had she gone too far? Had Chelsea seen something that could implicate her? And most importantly, what would happen next? Emily knew one thing for certain: the night of poison was only the beginning. The sterile smell of the hospital greeted Emily as she stepped through the automatic doors. Andrew had been rushed into the emergency room hours ago, and the doctors still hadn't given her any updates. She sat in the waiting area, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. Chelsea was nowhere to be seen, and Emily wasn't sure if she was relieved or disappointed by the blonde's absence. Finally, a doctor emerged, his face lined with exhaustion. "Mrs. Weston," he said, motioning for her to follow him. "Your husband is stable for now, but we found traces of a toxic substance in his system. We're running more tests to identify it. Have you noticed anything unusual in his diet or behavior lately?" Emily shook her head, feigning ignorance. "No, nothing out of the ordinary," she replied, her voice steady despite the lie. The doctor nodded, his expression unreadable. "We'll keep you updated." As he walked away, Emily felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Detective Grace Harper, a sharp-eyed woman with a no-nonsense demeanor. "Mrs. Weston, I'm here to ask you a few questions," she said, her tone polite but firm. Emily's heart raced, but she nodded. "Of course, anything to help." The detective led her to a quieter corner of the waiting area. "Do you know of anyone who might have a reason to harm your husband?" Harper asked, her piercing gaze fixed on Emily. Emily hesitated, then shook her head. "No, Andrew is well liked by everyone. I can't imagine anyone wanting to hurt him." "And what about Chelsea Monroe?" the detective pressed. "We were told she was at the party." Emily's stomach churned at the mention of Chelsea's name, but she maintained her composure. "She's a business associate of Andrew's. They work closely together, but I don't know much about her." The detective made a note in her pad. "We'll need to speak with her as well. In the meantime, if you think of anything at all, that could help, please let us know." As Harper walked away, Emily exhaled slowly, her mind racing. Chelsea was undoubtedly a suspect, but Emily knew she wasn't innocent either. The question was, how much did Chelsea know? And how far would she go to protect herself? Hours later, Emily returned home to find the mansion eerily quiet. The party's remnants had been cleared away, leaving no trace of the chaos that had unfolded. Emily climbed the stairs to her bedroom, her thoughts heavy. She needed to stay ahead of the investigation, to ensure that no one could tie her to Andrew's poisoning. But as she lay in bed that night, sleep eluding her, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't the only one with secrets to hide. The morning sun filtered through the grand windows of the Weston mansion, its warmth a stark contrast to the chill that lingered in the house. Emily sat in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. Her thoughts were consumed by the events of the past days, each moment replaying in her mind with relentless precision. Chelsea had remained disturbingly quiet. No calls, no visits to the hospital, no signs of her at all. Emily found the silence unsettling. She doubted Chelsea's absence meant she had backed away from the situation. It felt more like a calculated retreat. Emily's phone buzzed, breaking her train of thought. It was a text from an unknown number. "We need to talk." Chelsea. Her heart skipped a beat as she stared at the message. She hesitated, debating whether to respond, before finally typing back, "Where?" Moments later, her phone chimed again. The coffee shop on Willow Street. Noon. By the time noon arrived, Emily was seated at a corner table in the small, quiet coffee shop, her dark hair pulled back into a sleek ponytail. She kept her sunglasses on, hoping to shield her expression from prying eyes. Chelsea walked in minutes later, her blonde hair tied in a messy bun, a stark departure from her usual polished appearance. Chelsea slid into the seat opposite Emily, her blue eyes scanning the room before settling on her. "You think you're clever, don't you?" she said, her voice low and sharp. Emily raised an eyebrow, keeping her tone calm. "I have no idea what you're talking about." Chelsea leaned in, her expression icy. Don't play innocent. I know you had something to do with Andrew's poisoning. Emily let out a soft laugh, leaning back in her chair. And what makes you so certain? Are you feeling guilty about something? Chelsea's jaw tightened. I'm not the one with a failing marriage and a motive for revenge. The tension between them crackled like electricity. Emily leaned forward, her voice a whisper. If I were you, I'd be very careful about throwing around accusations. You've got secrets too, Chelsea. And if you're not careful, they might just come to light. Chelsea's eyes narrowed, but before she could respond, the barista called out an order, breaking the moment. She stood abruptly, grabbing her purse. This isn't over, she said before walking out of the coffee shop, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts. Emily watched her leave, a faint smirk playing on her lips. Chelsea was rattled, and that was exactly what Emily wanted. But as she left the coffee shop and walked back to her car, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the game she was playing was becoming far more dangerous than she had anticipated. The tension that had been simmering between Emily and Chelsea now felt like a powder keg waiting to explode. The uneasy calm was shattered the next morning when Detective Harper called Emily, requesting a meeting at the Weston mansion. Emily's heart raced as she agreed, quickly tidying up the kitchen to project an air of normalcy. Harper arrived punctually, her sharp eyes scanning the opulent room. Mrs. Weston, she began, pulling out a small notebook. We've made some progress. During our search of the premises, we found an unmarked bottle containing a substance similar to what was found in your husband's system. Emily froze but quickly composed herself. And where was this bottle found? Harper studied her carefully before answering. In the pantry. Would you happen to know how it got there? Emily shook her head, her voice calm. The pantry is always well stocked, and I oversee most of the supplies. But we also have caterers and staff coming in for events. It's hard to keep track of everything. Harper didn't press further, but Emily could sense the detective's skepticism. As the conversation shifted to other matters, Emily's mind raced. She needed to find out who had planted the bottle in the pantry, and why. Later that day, Emily called the head of her catering team, pretending to follow up on the night of the party. Did anyone access the kitchen without permission? She asked casually. The response was swift. Not that I noticed, Mrs. Weston. But Chelsea Monroe did ask for a quiet spot to make a phone call. The revelation sent a chill down Emily's spine. Chelsea had been near the kitchen, possibly planting the bottle to incriminate her. If Chelsea wanted a war, she would get one. Emily decided to confront Chelsea again, but this time on her own terms. She sent a cryptic message. I know what you did. Meet me tonight at the pier. Come alone. The meeting was set for midnight. As Emily stood at the edge of the pier, the water lapping softly against the wooden posts, her heart pounded with anticipation. She saw Chelsea approaching, her blonde hair illuminated by the pale moonlight. What is this about? Chelsea demanded, her voice tense. Emily took a step closer. You planted that bottle in my pantry. Why? Chelsea's eyes widened slightly, but she quickly masked her reaction. You're paranoid, Emily. I had nothing to do with it. Emily smirked. You underestimate me. If I go down, you're coming with me. I have enough on you to ruin everything. The air crackled with unspoken threats as the two women faced off, their lives and secrets entwined in a dangerous dance. Emily knew the game was far from over, but she was determined to come out on top. As Chelsea turned and walked away, Emily's resolve hardened. She would uncover the truth and ensure her survival at any cost. The next morning, Emily woke early, her mind racing with possibilities. She had barely slept after the tense meeting with Chelsea at the pier. Despite Chelsea's denials, Emily was convinced the blonde had more to do with the poisoning than she let on. The pieces didn't all fit yet, but Emily was determined to make them align in her favor. Her thoughts were interrupted by a call from Detective Harper. Mrs. Weston, I have some follow-up questions. Can we meet today? Emily agreed, masking her nerves with a calm tone. She spent the morning rehearsing her responses, knowing Harper would be scrutinizing her every word. When Harper arrived, she carried a file under her arm. "We've reviewed footage from the party," Harper began, settling into a chair in the grand living room. "It shows Chelsea Monroe entering the kitchen alone several times during the evening." Emily felt a rush of vindication but kept her expression neutral. "That doesn't surprise me," she said. "Chelsea has always been overly familiar with our home." Harper raised an eyebrow. "She claimed she was looking for a private place to take calls. Does that sound consistent with her behavior?" Emily hesitated for effect. "I suppose it's possible. But Chelsea has always been ambitious. She's very close to Andrew. Maybe too close." Harper's gaze sharpened. "Are you suggesting she had a motive to harm your husband?" Emily folded her hands in her lap, pretending to deliberate. "I don't want to accuse anyone without proof, but I wouldn't dismiss the idea." Harper jotted down notes, her expression unreadable. "We're also reviewing financial records. Did you know your husband transferred a significant sum to Chelsea's account shortly before the party?" Emily's stomach lurched. This was news to her, and it complicated things. "I wasn't aware," she admitted. "But Andrew was generous. He often helped friends and colleagues." Harper closed her notebook. "We'll keep you updated. For now, please let us know if you recall anything else." As soon as Harper left, Emily dialed Andrew's lawyer. The financial transfer was troubling, and Emily needed answers. The lawyer confirmed the transaction but added an unexpected twist: Chelsea had pressured Andrew for the money, citing a personal emergency. Emily's thoughts raced. Was Chelsea using blackmail to extract money from Andrew? And if so, had it escalated to something more sinister? That evening, Emily reviewed the footage Harper mentioned. Watching Chelsea move through the kitchen, Emily noticed something peculiar. Chelsea didn't just linger, she opened a drawer Emily rarely used. When the camera angle shifted, Emily caught a glimpse of something shiny in Chelsea's hand. A sense of foreboding settled over her. Emily had always suspected Chelsea, but now she had a lead, one that might finally crack the alibi Chelsea so carefully constructed. It was time to act. Emily felt the weight of Harper's questions lingering long after their conversation. The detective was closing in, but on whom? That evening, Emily retreated to her study, replaying every detail Harper had revealed about the case. She stared at the footage from the party again, scrutinizing every frame of Chelsea's movements in the kitchen. In one fleeting moment, Chelsea glanced nervously over her shoulder before tucking something into her purse. It was subtle, but enough to confirm Emily's suspicions. She paused the video and zoomed in, though the grainy resolution offered no clear answers. Emily's heart raced. What had Chelsea been hiding? The following day, Emily decided to take action. She visited Andrew's lawyer, under the guise of handling routine paperwork. While there, she casually mentioned the transfer of funds to Chelsea. The lawyer frowned. Yes, it was a large sum. Chelsea claimed it was for a pressing matter, though Andrew didn't elaborate. He seemed conflicted about it. Conflicted how? Emily pressed. He hesitated, as if he knew there might be repercussions. But Andrew always had a soft spot for helping people close to him. Emily left the office more determined than ever to expose Chelsea. The money wasn't just a favor, it was leverage. Whatever Chelsea was hiding, Emily was now certain it tied directly to the poisoning. That evening, Emily arranged a dinner at the mansion, inviting a small circle of Andrew's closest friends, including Chelsea. The room buzzed with subdued tension as the guests arrived. Chelsea entered last, her confident facade intact, though Emily noticed the faintest flicker of unease in her eyes. During the meal, Emily played the gracious host, but her words carried sharp undertones directed at Chelsea. "Isn't it wonderful how trust can bind us together?" Emily said, her gaze piercing. "It's such a rare quality these days." Chelsea shifted in her seat but managed a tight smile. "Absolutely. Trust is everything." Emily's plan unfolded when she offered a toast. Raising her glass, she declared, to uncovering truths and cherishing transparency in all our relationships. As glasses clinked, Chelsea's hand trembled slightly, spilling a drop of wine. Emily locked eyes with her, a silent challenge hanging in the air. Chelsea avoided her gaze, her mask of composure cracking just enough for Emily to catch. Later, as the guests mingled, Emily cornered Chelsea near the fireplace. "We need to talk," she whispered, her voice laced with icy resolve. Chelsea smirked, though her confidence faltered. "I have nothing to say to you." "Perhaps not here," Emily said, her tone calm but menacing. "But if you don't want Detective Harper knowing what I've discovered, I suggest we meet tomorrow." Chelsea's bravado faded, replaced by a flicker of fear. She nodded reluctantly, her voice barely audible. "Fine. Tomorrow." As Chelsea walked away, Emily felt a surge of control returning. The game was far from over, but the pieces were falling into place. Tomorrow would bring answers, and possibly, the endgame. The next morning, Emily arrived early at the agreed meeting spot, a secluded garden in the city park. The air was heavy with the scent of blooming flowers, an ironic contrast to the tension coursing through her. She sat on a wrought iron bench, her posture poised, but her thoughts sharp and calculating. Chelsea arrived a few minutes later, her usual confidence muted. Her blonde hair was tied back, and her lips were pressed into a thin line. She sat opposite Emily without a word, her eyes scanning the area as if checking for unwanted observers. Emily broke the silence. "I know everything, Chelsea. The money, the poison, the lies." Chelsea crossed her arms, her expression icy. "You don't know anything." Emily leaned forward, her voice low but firm. "The bottle of poison wasn't just found in my pantry, it was placed there deliberately. And the footage from the party shows you in the kitchen, looking far too nervous for someone making a simple phone call." Chelsea's face tightened, but she said nothing. "You pressured Andrew for money," Emily continued. "He gave it to you because he felt guilty. Guilty about the affair? Or guilty about something else?" Chelsea's veneer cracked slightly, a flicker of panic crossing her face. "You don't understand," she snapped. "Andrew wasn't innocent in all this." Emily tilted her head, her dark eyes narrowing. "Then help me understand. Because from where I'm sitting, you look very guilty." Chelsea hesitated, her hands clenching into fists. Finally, she exhaled sharply. "Andrew promised me everything. He said he'd leave you, that we'd start over. But he lied. He was never going to leave. And so you decided to poison him?" Emily's voice was calm, almost mocking. "Was that your way of starting over?" "No." Chelsea shot back, her voice trembling. I didn't poison him. I just wanted to scare him. Make him realize what he stood to lose." Emily's lips curled into a faint smile. "A scare that conveniently made you the main beneficiary of his will if he didn't survive?" Chelsea froze, her face draining of color. "How do you know about that?" Emily sat back, her victory nearly complete. "Let's just say I've been doing my homework. Detective Harper is going to love hearing this." Panic flashed in Chelsea's eyes, and she reached out, grabbing Emily's wrist. "You can't tell her. Please, Emily. You don't understand, he deserved it." Emily stared at her for a long moment before yanking her hand free. "What Andrew deserved is between him and his conscience. But what you did goes beyond betrayal. It's criminal." Chelsea stood abruptly, her breathing ragged. "You think you're so righteous, Emily? You're just as guilty as I am. Maybe even more." Emily rose slowly, her voice icy. "The difference, Chelsea, is that I've played my cards better. And now it's your move." Chelsea turned and stormed away, leaving Emily alone in the garden. For the first time in weeks, Emily felt a sense of clarity. Chelsea's confession, however incomplete, was enough to seal her fate. The endgame was here, and Emily intended to win. All that remained was to deliver the final blow. The day after her confrontation with Chelsea, Emily sat alone in her study, her mind racing. The events of the past weeks had led her to this moment, and the stakes had never been higher. A knock at the door broke her concentration. It was Detective Harper, her expression as composed as ever. "Mrs. Weston," Harper began as she stepped into the room. "We've been reviewing the case further, and I thought it would be helpful to have a final discussion." Emily gestured for Harper to sit. "Of course, Detective. I want this resolved as much as you do." Harper opened her notebook and leaned forward slightly. "You mentioned before that you didn't suspect anyone specific, but I wanted to revisit Chelsea Monroe's involvement. New evidence suggests she might have had a more active role than we initially thought." Emily's heart skipped a beat, but she maintained her calm exterior. "I can't say I'm surprised. Chelsea always seemed opportunistic." Harper nodded. "She claimed she had no access to Andrew's financial affairs, but we found documentation showing otherwise. Transfers were made into her account over the course of several months. And the poison we found in the pantry? Traces of it were also found on personal items in her apartment." Emily let out a quiet breath, relief washing over her. Harper had all the evidence she needed to build a case against Chelsea. Still, there was one final piece to set the record straight. "There's something else," Emily said, her voice measured. "Chelsea admitted to me yesterday that she intended to scare Andrew with the poison. She claimed she never meant for it to go this far." Harper's eyebrows rose. "She confessed that to you?" "She did," Emily confirmed. "It was an emotional moment. I think she realized the walls were closing in." Harper made notes, her pen moving swiftly across the page. "Thank you for sharing this, Mrs. Weston. It corroborates much of what we've uncovered." As Harper stood to leave, Emily felt a strange mix of satisfaction and unease. She had navigated every twist and turn of this ordeal, but at what cost? Chelsea would be arrested, Andrew was still recovering in the hospital, and their once perfect life lay in ruins. 2 weeks later, Emily stood in her garden, the same spot where she had met Chelsea for their final confrontation. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the meticulously trimmed hedges. She held a glass of wine in her hand, savoring the bittersweet taste of victory. Andrew had returned home, his body weakened but his mind sharper than ever. Their conversations were polite but distant, a reflection of the cracks that could never be fully repaired. Emily knew their marriage would never return to what it had been, but she was no longer clinging to the illusion of perfection. As the first stars appeared in the evening sky, Emily allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She had survived betrayal, deception, and the specter of suspicion. She had outmaneuvered Chelsea and protected herself from the fallout. But the price had been steep, trust lost, innocence shattered, and a lingering emptiness that no amount of cunning could fill. Emily raised her glass in a quiet toast. "To the truth," she murmured, her voice barely audible above the rustle of the garden leaves. "Whatever it's worth." As she sipped her wine, a faint smile played on her lips. The game was over, and Emily Weston had won. But the victory felt hollow, a reminder that in the pursuit of truth and justice, no one escapes unscathed.